Hey, everybody. Welcome back to our latest edition of the OI Digital Projects Coffee House. My name is Jim Ambuski. I'm joined as always by Martha Howard from the OI. We're delighted to welcome you to the end of February for one of we still got a few more presentations to go before the end of the term. So we're kind of rounding third and heading for home here in terms of the semester. And today, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Holly Brewer, who's the Burke Chair of American Cultural and Intellectual History and Associate Professor at the University of College Park, Maryland, and Dr. Michael Becker, who's an Assistant Research Professor also at the University of Maryland, College Park. And they are going to be talking to us today about their digital project, Slavery, Law, and Power in the British Empire and Early America. And so, Holly and Michael, take it away.
Hi. So this project, Slavery, Law, and Power, started out with me and then graduate student Lauren Mahalik, who's now at Michigan State, working on what we thought was going to be just a small edited volume. And I think originally it was coming out of my work on the role of the British Empire and the origins of American slavery, but initially the thought was I was so frustrated with so much of the Locke scholarship being so uninformed about the broader context of power. And I thought, well, we'll just put together a little reader. And I asked Lauren to help, which would just have some documents that would illuminate the larger background for what's going on, so that we stopped sort of simplistically assuming that Locke somehow had this position of huge power and that he was speaking for the majority. And so we started working on some edited documents that might be in this reader. And that was 10 years ago in 2016. And somehow or another, along the way, it turned into a larger digital humanities project, actually about the time of the pandemic. It's always been a group project, never just me. And Michael's been on board in some way or another, for the past 4 years. So we have prepared a brief overview of what we're trying to do. We've been funded by the National Historic Publications and Records Commission, as well as the American Society for Legal History, the William Nelson Cromwell Foundation, and the University of Maryland in doing this work. We have a lot of emphasis on accessibility. We are most of all, especially in this world that we live in now, where there's so much misinformation and disinformation, focused on creating access to the primary sources. So, and particularly to manuscript sources, where so much of the important story of the role of empire resides. So not in sources that are already published, certainly not published often at the time. So the idea is to create access to the original documents and to transcriptions. We launched a website in 2022, and we fiddled around with different ways of presenting the website. We use a WordPress format, which we'll talk about more in just a little bit. So the governing themes and philosophies behind the project are to explore imperial policies and their role as opposed to individual colonies, although we talk about that too, but in the origins and development of slavery in the empire, and particularly the British Empire, although we have some materials from both the Spanish and French Empire in particular, and I've talked about adding some from the Dutch. We place them into context and conversation with each other, and we focus on works regarding power, authority, enslavement, law, censorship, because that was a big issue. That's part of why so much is in manuscript, and democracy. We take a broad view of politics and political actors, by which we mean that we don't see politics as simply what you would see in a session of Parliament or in a petition to Parliament or in debates in a colonial assembly, but we see it as slave rebellions are a kind of politics and other kinds of resistance. So we try to treat the issue of political conversation, especially in as much as there is a political reaction to a rebellion, in a really broad way. And this makes it an inclusive project. And in particular, we focus on transcribing early modern manuscripts and print manuscripts, print books that relate to those. We bridge work spread across different geographic archives. So, for example, we examined the 3 surviving earliest manuscript versions of the first slave code in the British Empire, which The first comprehensive one is, of course, passed in Barbados in 1661, and we've evaluated those, decided which is the best version. Even it only dates from 1667 after there's been some alterations. And even though those are at three different archives, the Huntington, the National Archives UK, and the Barbados National Archives, which is now not open to the public because of a fire. Anyway, that's the kind of work we've been doing. And we've been working on making sure that what we do is open access so that people can use it in teaching, scholars can use it, and the general public if they're interested. And we also include things like maps when they seem appropriate. We have an advisory board which has given input, and we've also had various teams, usually at least 5 or 6 at any given time, when we consider what documents to bring to the site and which to prioritize in terms of transcribing and posting. We try to look at documents that are either really important or bring up really important issues, like what are the connections between the origins of democracy and the origins of slavery. They were developing at the same time, but were they developing mostly in counterpoint or mostly together? This is, I think, one of the biggest questions about early America and the origins of slavery. Um, Consider how slavery was legitimized and challenged. Consider racism within a political framework. But also the other issue, and we didn't put it on here, but the other issue is we also really try to prioritize documents that represent broader collections so that can be gateways for scholars into examining larger manuscript collections, which have often been less explored. And one of the things that I've been so pleased about doing is because I've become friends with so many archivists as part of this, including at the National Archives UK, at the Bodleian Library, and working with them to identify documents and collections that scholars haven't really been using at all. Because scholars keep going back to the same few documents that someone else, one person originally identified. And often there's a lot of other documents and other collections that nobody's even knowing about or knowing where to look. So we try to provide documents that are also signposts to larger collections. Um, you want to take the next part, Michael?
Sure. So the basic organization of our website is into a collection of more or less chronological chapters that map onto broader political and social developments throughout the empire. And so each chapter opens with a brief introduction, sort of setting the stage. And then you come across a page which links to multiple documents or sets of documents. On each document page, generally we begin with a brief scholarly introduction, including ample citations and footnotes, followed by a set of guiding questions, usually around 3 or 5, that are appropriate for classroom use. And then you have the document itself. And generally what we're trying to do is track down the earliest extant version of the document, reproduce color images of the document, often that we've taken with our own cameras, sometimes through scans from the archive or library, and then side by side, a line by line transcription of the document. Generally, we try to reproduce original spelling and punctuation. We do expand out abbreviations, especially if they're uncommon to modern readers. And we try to include annotations to clarify particular terms, particular contexts that might be unfamiliar to, an average university student.
And can I just add here quickly, in terms of this document that's on the screen, that this, although it's dated 1682, was a retranscription at that point in 1682 of the earliest surviving version of the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina. So it's actually really cool, and this is part of the records of the state archives in South Carolina. So this is one example, and we actually now have up on the site various versions of the fundamental constitutions as those changed over time. And we looked at who's making the changes and what are the purpose and how those changes fit with the politics in England. So one of the really interesting things is in 1682, there's famous language that's not in this version that gets put into the second version of the fundamental constitutions, giving absolute power to masters over slaves. And that is taken away in the third version in 1682 and restored in 1685. And you'll see some of that in just a minute when James II, who's in charge of the slave trade, becomes king. So, why manuscript sources? Do you want to do that, Michael?
Yeah, so while we do include some print sources, particularly when they're either particularly rare or particularly important to the broader themes we're engaging with, the focus of our work has been manuscript sources. It's for a number of reasons. Certainly, they're crucial source space, especially for early modern history. There's a lot of things that's in manuscript that never make it to print. Manuscript sources are particularly difficult to access. You have something printed, it's more likely to have multiple copies scattered in multiple libraries and archives, more likely to be digitized. Um, but even where collections of manuscript sources have been digitized, and here I'm thinking about things like the Colonial State Papers or the Adam Matthews collections, Colonial America or Colonial Caribbean, many times they're hidden behind paywalls. And so they're not equally accessible to all scholars. They depend on scholars having library access at a well-resourced institution. Within this time frame, too, of course, access to printing presses was contingent. Certainly, you needed certain kinds of resources and connections in order to print a book or a pamphlet. But even more significantly, during some of the period we focus on, the Restoration, there were royal censors. And so dissident views had much more difficult time getting printed. So manuscript becomes more important.
I was just going to say, if there was something called an imprimatur, which you had to get, which was a royal approval from Roger Lestrange. I'm convinced that Bellatrix Lestrange in Harry Potter, by the way, is named after Roger Lestrange. She's like this infamous villain in British history. He was a censor between 1660 and 1689. But even if you made it past the censor, even if they somehow missed something that you wrote that was problematic, and by the way, slavery was royal policy, so it was seditious to criticize slavery. Even if you somehow snuck it past Roger Lestrange and his core of employees, you still could be prosecuted for seditious libel or for treason for what you wrote. So there's multiple layers of monitoring, especially print sources. Manuscript sources can still be dangerous. As we know, Algernon Sidney was Roger Lestrange broke into Algernon Sidney's house in 1683 and in a trunk found his manuscript of discourses concerning government, which is, of course, Jefferson said was influential on him in writing the Declaration, just for the broad picture, right? And that was used at his trial for treason as the key evidence to convict him of treason, even though it was only a theoretical critique of monarchy in principle. So, manuscripts can still be dangerous, but you see much more through the manuscripts than you do through the printed sources.
And of course, paleography is a skill. I don't know about all of you. I've certainly found in the classroom, my students struggle to read anything in handwriting. Cursive is not part of most of their K through 12 education. And then you add in the challenges of early modern handwriting, where letters can look very different, where spelling is more irregular, etc. If I were to give them a handwritten document from the late 1600s, early 1700s, they wouldn't understand it. And so being able to offer the transcribed version and a transcribed version that includes key annotations that provide the definitions, the context that are necessary for someone to understand it makes those sources much more accessible. And I'll also just add here, one thing we've realized as we go through the project is that in many cases, scholars have relied on later printed editions assuming that they are accurate versions of the original. And, in some cases they are, in other cases they are not. And we'll talk more about some of the examples we've seen of that. But going back to the original manuscript can actually be really important to make sure we actually understand, you know, for example, what this law actually said, as opposed to what it said after it was amended 20 years later.
So this is just some of the team who's involved in the project right now. And I know Elizabeth said she might come today. And by the way, Elizabeth and I are giving a paper in person at the 100 Institute on Thursday on something that actually came out of this project, a document that came out of this project, where I feel like our combined expertise is really what helped us unpack its significance. It's about a treasure map, essentially, purchased by Charles I when he was a prince in Madrid in 1623, that we argue helped guide his policies towards his pursuit of a broader empire in the Caribbean and pursuit of slavery. So we'll talk about that a little bit on Thursday. But anyway, this is some of the team who's involved right now, and Michael is, of course, associate editor of the project. So this is an article that I also published related that to work. I mean, I had only been going to get pictures of these various versions of the fundamental constitutions because I wanted to add it to our website, and I wanted to explore what was in 2003 an explosive claim by David Armitage that John Locke had written the key passages adding the words absolute power of masters over slaves to the second version of the fundamental constitutions. And I went to take photographs, and I realized immediately, partly because I've worked so much with Locke's handwriting, among others, that in fact it was not his handwriting at all. And I consulted with a bunch of others, and I then worked out in detail exactly the different versions of the versions for Locke studies. But doing this article came directly out of the work that I was doing for this project. So in other words, the detailed access to the manuscripts opens up all kinds of possibilities, and not just for me and not just for Elizabeth and not just for Michael, but for others who've been involved in this project. And I want to also add that we accept contributions from others for important documents that should be published and shared and made accessible. And so this is an opportunity. We try to make it really egalitarian and make sure people involved, everyone involved, gets credit at all stages. If anybody has any questions about this, feel free to ask me. But you can also just look at the article, which, by the way, is absolutely completely full of pictures of the different versions of the manuscript copies and why it matters and how the 5 different versions of the fundamental constitutions connected to English politics in the 17th century, and arguing essentially that its origins of the fundamental constitutions and the language is about absolute power of masters over slaves comes out of language that's in the original charter for Carolina from 1629, which gives absolute power to the proprietor. So anyway, I'm going to stop there on that one.
I think another example of this, if you are familiar with the scholarship on colonial Carolina, you'll realize that many of the scholars working on the early colony and the development of the law of slavery there are continually citing back to a printed volume of laws printed in the 1840s as representative, showing these different laws and how they change over time. And for quite some time, the wisdom had been that some of these laws no longer existed in manuscript form. Holly was able to make a trip down to Columbia, South Carolina, and connect with the lead archivist at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. And through collective effort, we're able to track down many, though not all, of the earliest slave laws in Carolina.
In the manuscript, yeah.
Yes.
As opposed to the 1840 printed version, yeah.
And one of the things that's striking, particularly looking at this 1690 code, which is the earliest in South Carolina, you see a great number of annotations, of edits that have either not been recorded in the typed 1840 version, or have been silently included so that you can't see that there was clearly some arguing and debate over what specific clauses, what specific wording would be. And so we're still in the process of fully unpacking what these amendments, what these alterations to the text may portend. But I think it is suggestive of what we miss sometimes when we're not looking at the manuscript.
Yeah, and I want to also emphasize we're not even going to be the final people doing this interpretation. We're providing it to others. So this is a resource for others to use and unpack and make sense of. We just create usually short introductions, unless we, like me, I went off and wrote a bigger article because I felt like I had to. But um, these are resources for scholars, for students, for others.
We are, of course, want to be a resource for scholars. We also want this to be a resource for teaching and for students. And so, as we're designing the site, we want to make sure that if, say, an advanced high school student, an undergraduate student comes across the site, is using it to read and understand documents, they have the context and they have the information they need to understand what's going on. So, this is part of the philosophy of how we write introductions. It's part of how and why we annotate. And it also leads to a variety of other tools we've added to the site. One we're particularly proud of. We found a mid 1700s board game through which Brits would have learned about and begun to understand the scope and the characteristics of the empire. It's a game that is fairly similar to today's Chutes and Ladders. So we've recreated the game on the website with dice and instructions so that students could play it themselves and get to understand a bit experientially what that process of learning about the empire might have been like.
Yeah. Can I just say the reason I actually found this game in the first place is it was once reproduced and sold in the print shop at Colonial Williamsburg. So I found it there. I used it in class myself. And then had found other versions and had copies made so more could play in person. And then, yeah, that's what led in the long run. But it works really well in teaching.
And likewise, we've created several timelines, several maps, and we're currently working in collaboration with high school teachers at local College Park Academy and creating a summer class for rising high school students. And many of the resources we'll be creating through that process as we tweak and refine them will also be added to our site for both high school and university educators. So I'll just say a couple quick things about tech elements, since I know this may be of interest. We are generally transcribing all the documents on our site manually on the transcription platform from the page, which is great. We can talk more about that in Q&A. Each transcription, once completed, is reviewed at least twice, including at least once by a senior editor, someone with a PhD and background in the subject, before it's finalized and published online. From the page enables us, through the use of tags, to generate TEI and XML versions of documents. And we are continually making steps to ensure that our online work is going to be preserved, even if something should happen to the website or to either of us. We're regularly uploading both the TEI XML versions of our transcriptions, the introductions, the images of documents to both OSF, the Open Science Foundation framework, and DRUM, University of Maryland's digital repository, which both promise secure storage for at least 50 years. And these resources are also accessible through either of those platforms.
I still am holding out the possibility of making kind of curated digital editions of some of these documents when we get to a certain point. It's really easy to download them in a fully edited way from the platform we use and from the page. And so we might do that, essentially curate kind of units, as it were, for teaching, whether in a college class or a high school class. But we like also a lot of what we're able to do with the website itself, which you only seen images of. But hopefully you can email us, and here's again some of the support we've got. But slaverylawpower.org is the website. Feel free to go and explore, and we've organized it by chapters, and you can click on different things. And in fact, maybe I'll try to pull that up in just a minute. But that's it for our presentation, and feel free to ask questions.
Well, that was great. Well, thank you very much. And to kind of kick us off, I was thinking about the document selection process and wondering if there is a document or a series of documents that you encountered and really thought seriously about putting into the archive, but ultimately decided not to. And if so, what was the vetting process like? What kind of things were you thinking about as you were ultimately deciding to pass on that document or document collection?
Can I just say that the problem is usually not that we think something's unsuitable, because there's so much that's suitable and that's relevant and interesting. I guess probably one of the main things that we worried about how they would be interpreted as some of the demeaning images of Black people wearing silver collars, which I do talk about in my book, for example. So we chose one relatively dignified sketch from 1677, and we put that on some of the others we haven't. But I think the larger issue for us is just prioritizing what makes it through the process quickly, what is most important in terms of being representative or helping to untangle problems that we know other scholars will be interested in. Does that make sense? Do you have thoughts you want to add on that, Michael?
Yeah, we're conscious that some of this late 17th, early 18th century material is perhaps less represented in terms of what's available online. And so that has been a particular point of focus for us. We, do ultimately hope and plan to more fully cover the span from the beginning of early English involvement in slavery and the slave trade to emancipation in the British Empire and in the U.S. But I'd say a particular strong point of our website to this point has been the Stuart period and the early 1700s.
Yeah, I think that's right. We also focus on things that we know people haven't been able to access, and we know that it's important to do so. So things like the Barbados slave code. So I'm going to actually share just the website so you can see it. To get a sense, you can look at our list of what we call our sample documents, which we produce every year. And you can get a sense. This is this Barbados slave code, and you can see what we did is we took the best, what we think is the earliest version, the most reliable. We show you the front page of the document. We show you what the handwriting looked like. And you can see it isn't, if you aren't reading this all the time, it's not necessarily easy, right? And then we have here next to it a transcription. You can get a sense of the kinds of documents we have on the site. These are, for example, Jefferson's handwritten notes on the 1732 Debt Recovery Act, which I don't know if any of you know my work on the creating a common law of slavery for Britain and its New World Empire, but there's a crucial provision making people into property was done by the High Court in England in 1677. And in 1732, it was embodied into a parliamentary act called the 1732 Debt Recovery Act. And Claire Priest in particular has worked a little bit on that too. And it turns out Jefferson had his own handwritten copy of the Debt Recovery Act, which said, people are property for the purposes of recovery of debts. And you can look at that here along with a transcription and along with some of his notes on the side about what is important about that act. Or this one is interesting. It's Governor Gooch of Virginia to one of the authorities in England talking about why they didn't think free Black men should be able to vote in Virginia. And again, don't think this story is really well known. It shouldn't get much more attention, and it gives you a sense about, this is a letter justifying an act, hoping that it will be approved by the Board of Trade and the King in England, and explaining exactly why they were doing what they were doing. And it gives you a sense of the importance, of this kind of negotiation, and how laws were created. We tend to assume, oh, the colonies are on their own, they're making their own laws, but every single law was being negotiated with imperial authorities. And of course, governors had standing orders to veto a lot of different kinds of laws, but this is one example of that kind of interaction. Anyway, I'm going to just stop. You guys can explore things on your own. So.
Alexander asked, how are you planning material curriculum for high school students? Are you planning to create a whole separate set of activities, or are you looking for something scalable for college classes as well?
Both. Most immediately, we're working to create a 3-week intensive class specifically targeted at high school students through the Young Terps program here at the University of Maryland. And so that course will be a self-contained unit. But as we're doing that, we're also thinking, is there an activity here that a high school teacher could employ in their classroom for 20 minutes that would help students think about how slavery develops in the earliest British colonies in North America? Or, here's a lesson plan that a teacher could use to talk about Constitutional Convention and how debates about slavery are playing into the formation of the broader structure of the new U.S. government. And so it's a both and.
And I mean, ideally, we'd anticipate that college students would want much more complex materials. But part of what we're doing as well, and we have separate funding for it from the University of Maryland, is we're setting up an internship program that's going to pair high school students who've been through this class with college students who've taken a similar class, which will be paid internships to essentially do hands-on discovery and transcription and introduction of documents themselves. So we're essentially trying to teach history in a kind of lab format, like as an empowering tool, as part of this project.
I'm thinking about all the kind of complex parts you have here in terms of, document acquisition, transcription, curricular development. Can you maybe sort of walk us through the life cycle of a document from we found it through publication and deployment into the classroom?
Yeah, we find documents a number of different ways. In some cases, we know a document's importance, like the Barbados Slave Code, and we are like, okay, where actually is the earliest extant version?
Is it published anywhere in a reliable version? Answer, no, right? Yeah.
But in other cases, we come across things in the course of our archival research or from colleagues or grad students that suggest things that are like, hey, I was at the Massachusetts Historical Society, or I was at the archives in Trinidad, and I came across this thing, and I think it could be a good fit for your project. And so when we do that, one of our first priorities is to obtain high quality photographs of the document and upload it from the page so that we can complete, reliable transcriptions. And so, that itself is usually, a process of at least a month or two, depending, of course, on the length and the difficulty of the document, because it has to go through multiple review processes. And then usually alongside, or depending on schedule, afterwards, one of the scholars affiliated with the project is working on preparing a strong introduction and the additional scholarly apparatus, such as the footnotes and annotations that will accompany that.
While you're talking, I'm going to just share from the page because people might not know it. We went through a lot of possibilities for how we were going to do transcriptions, and for a variety of reasons, this works really well. It's run by this great couple from the page, or I'll start to share it. What From the Page does is it essentially puts in a lot of the formatting that allows you to share materials in different versions and to download them in different ways. It's really easy to do the transcription. So when I transcribe, for example, you see here the original document on the left and the transcription on the right. When I transcribe, I tend to like to do it. You'll see, I do it in a version that lets me put the text above. And then I sorry, there it goes. Layout image at the top is what I usually do. And then I can just have a sliver that I'm transcribing, and then you just put it up here. So this is news about a slave rebellion in Antigua, and they ask for more troops to be sent there, um and this is a lot about what was happening there, why it emerged, who was leading it, how they were taking steps to control the population of enslaved people. And there's a lot of really interesting information here. This has been written about a little bit, including by Barry Gaspar, who's Michael's dissertation advisor at Duke a long time ago, or a while ago. But in fact, there could be a lot more done with this. Jason Sharples, I think, has mentioned it a little bit in his book too. But this, again, there's a lot more stories that could be told out of this material, especially in conversation with some of the others. So by making materials like this accessible, we can make it easier. But anyway, I'm going to go back just to the main page. We can download it then in different formats that could be either put on a web or could be published as part of a book, honestly. And we are really big fans of this platform for how it easily encodes a lot of what we would need to do. And I'm going to stop sharing.
And Good asks, is From the Page a platform you need to pay for? Yes, they do offer a 200-page trial. So you can upload as an individual 200 pages to the site to transcribe free of charge. And then there is a subscription cost above that. We are one of several projects at University of Maryland that use From the Page. And so we are able to bundle our subscription together and share costs.
So we pay about $1,500 a year for our part of it. And it's definitely worth it. It's a great platform.
Yeah, I may have mentioned it on this program before, but I'm equally a big fan of From the Page and of Ben and Sarah Brunfield who run it. They're great folks, and it's a great pedagogical tool in addition to a transcription tool. So if you have students who want to be involved in a project like this, or your museum who's interested in community engagement, it's a good way to do that. But it leads kind of naturally into one of the bits that was on one of your last slides, which was about the possibility of adopting AI assisted transcription into your workflows. We've talked a little bit about that on this series before with Jane Landers and Daniel Jenkins from Vanderbilt. And so I'm wondering, thinking about your approach to adopting or potentially using AI assisted handwritten transcription software in this project.
So I've been actively exploring that since 2022. I gave a talk at the American Philosophical Society about using Transcribus in 2022. Transcribus has been the main platform to do transcription, and by 2022 they were at about 95% accuracy. And frankly, you're not going to get much better than that in terms of training models to read early modern handwriting. But the problem then, and it remains a problem, is that they're proprietary. It's a black box. So you train models for them, you pay to train models for them, and then they own that ability. They've been working with Adam Matthews, so that's why Adam Matthews, the documentary project, they're in fact part owners of Transcribus. So that's why you can search up manuscript materials for their databases, which I don't know if your library owns some, but ours does. But recently, I'm pretty sure they sold some of those models to Gemini 3. So Gemini 3, which is a large language model, now has the ability to do pretty good early modern text recognition. But again, this is proprietary. And so one of the things we've been exploring for the last few years is working with a different platform called eScriptorium, which is not proprietary, and different programs to do the transcription. And then the other problem, Gemini 3, again, this is actually a brand new capability just in the last month or two. And I'll let Michael add more about that in just a second. But part of the problem is if you do choose to use it, they kind of own whatever you've put in. And in terms of reading early modern slave codes, we know which all, have racism abundant in them. The idea that it could be sort of silently incorporated into a large language model and emerge in somebody's version of like, how do I write a law about this? And they might be drawing on a 17th century slave code silently. I mean, there's just horrific possibilities here that you can begin to imagine that there are so many ethical conversations that need to be had as part of this. Michael, I'll let you take it from here.
As Holly gestured to, there's a lot of conversations here. I think we are also very cognizant that this is a technology that has, prompted huge interest. Certainly a lot of us feel like university administrators are really keen on incorporating it. There's all sorts of centers and funding popping up around AI, even as funding for many other kinds of research is drying up. And so I think we want to think about what does the ethical use of this look like? What are the things this technology is actually well suited for? What are things that it is not good at, but is still being deployed to do? And are there ways we can work with it? Personally, I have experimented with Gemini Pro 3. I honestly was pretty surprised at how capable it was of reading some of this early modern handwriting. It is not perfect. There is, modest amount of hallucination that happens, especially when it's confronted with particularly difficult handwriting or particularly strange formatting. But there
It's a
is
start.
something going on here we have to reckon with.
But I also want to say that even when you get to something like 95%, right? That's 95% and counting every letter in a word, right? So, and if you got one letter different, think about words like dead or lead, for example. Two very different words with completely different meanings. You could use these for doing word searches, but they're not the final version. You have to have a step in between where human beings go back through and check and fix things, right? That the humans have to be in the loop the entire time. But I want to also just say this is brand new. This is like the last month, 2 months, and that Ben and
I
Sarah
think
been
it's
putting
like
on
November.
YouTube. Yeah, have November have actually quite a good half-hour video on and using it on from the page and their experiments and their sense of its relative accuracy. So, but again, there are huge risks there. We have to always think about, if we do start to go down this road, what kind of monopoly power are we giving to which programs to interpret our evidence for us? I mean, and thinking about where do humans fit in all this?
Yeah, I think it's a nice reminder that humans should be involved with the humanities. Holly, Michael, thank you very much for joining us today, and remind us where we can find your website.
Slaverylawpower.org. And also feel free to reach out to both or either of us with any further questions folks have. I know we both got pretty excited and maybe didn't create as much airtime for everyone who wants to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for coming today. It was really fun to talk about it.
Thanks very much. We'll see you all in a couple weeks.